Let's talk about the implications for the US of Trump's tariffs. Well, we know that the Trump administration is going to impose, or has imposed, a 20% tariff on Chinese imports, 25% tariff on Mexican and Canadian imports, and a 25% world tariff on steel and aluminium. The Trump administration has also announced that on the 2nd of April 2025, a new 25% worldwide tariff will be imposed on imported cars and car parts. Canada and Mexico will be exempted from the tariff on car parts. Let's now try and think at a microeconomic level about different kinds of markets which will be affected by these tariffs. In general terms, what we'll use here is the simple demand-supply tool. Now, this obviously is not an accurate representation of reality, but it does give us some qualitative information about what is likely to happen to prices and quantities in these different markets. So let's first think about an importer. So this is a business which is simply importing goods and services, probably just goods, largely for retail purposes. So this could be, relatively cheap toys or cheap manufactured goods from China, for example, or it could be agricultural goods. So if we start off with a simple demand-supply curve, then the imposition of the tariff is going to be an additional cost, if you like, imposed upon the sellers of this product. Now, in the demand-supply model, that simply shifts the supply curve up. So we get a new equilibrium point in which the price of the product rises and the quantity of the imported product would fall as a result. If we then think about a local producer who is competing against those imports, so they're producing a very similar product, maybe not identical to the imported products, but sufficiently close to be regarded as a substitute. In that case, we start off with the demand-supply curve, and we would then expect the demand for the locally produced product to rise. In this case, we would have, assuming an upward sloping supply curve, of course this is always debatable, nonetheless we'd have an increase in price and an increase in the quantity being produced. Presumably that would increase employment in this sector as well. Then we've got, let's say, a local US business which is producing goods, services that are not competing directly with imports, but nonetheless uses imported resources or imported inputs in its production process. Well, in that case, similar to the first case, there would be an increase in the costs of production for the firms in those markets. And we would then expect the supply curve to shift upwards and a new equilibrium price that's higher and a lower equilibrium quantity being produced. Lucky last, we've got the most complex case, which is a local US firm that is competing against imported products, but at the same time is also using imported inputs in its production process. In this case, we would expect, on the one hand, an increase in the demand for the locally produced import competing product as consumers switch to the local product that doesn't have the tariff imposed on it. But at the same time, we would also expect a rise in the costs experienced by these very firms because of the tariff imposed on the inputs they use in their production process. Now, the way that I've drawn it here, we can see that the equilibrium price has risen, but the equilibrium quantity has actually fallen, presumably also meaning that there would be a fall in employment in this sector as well. But this is actually indeterminate. It depends on how much costs rise relative to the increase in demand. So it's also possible that there would be if there were a small increase in the costs of production, then we might see something more like this. In which case we still get an increase in prices, but in this instance, an increase in the quantity produced and sold. And presumably that would involve more employment in this sector. So it's in the last case, theoretically at least, it's indeterminate as to what will happen to the quantity being produced, whether it will rise or fall, and correspondingly whether employment in the sector will rise or fall. The upshot for the average household is, as we saw in all of those instances, it involved an increase in prices, either for the imported final goods or an increase in prices of the locally produced goods as well. There were no instances where prices fell because of the imposition of tariffs on imports. So this increases the cost of living for the average household. It's unclear what the overall impact would be on employment. That would require detailed information about the specific dynamics of the particular markets or industries that would be affected. We could say something worse could arise, however, and that is if this causes sustained inflation over time, then it's possible that the Reserve Bank in the United States may raise interest rates in an attempt to rein in aggregate demand and thereby try to decrease the overall inflation rate. This obviously would, not, in addition to the increased cost of living, would hurt indebted households and indebted firms. It increases the loan installments they have to make, and is also likely to stifle investment to some extent. There's also another factor which we need to consider, and that is investor uncertainty. Investor choices about whether to borrow money to build new plant and equipment to expand production is going to be dependent on interest rates, the price of borrowing money, but also the expected returns on those projects in the future. Unfortunately, Trump and foreign retaliation or negotiations with the Trump administration are not predictable at this point in time. So if import competing investors, who are really supposed to be the beneficiaries of the tariffs, they don't really know what to expect in the future. They don't know what interest rates are going to be doing, and if they don't know what their expected returns on any investment would be, they're less likely to invest in expanding supply. Worse still, if the fall in investment does occur, then this could cause a fall in the overall demand for goods and services in the economy as a whole, which could lead the US economy falling into recession. Now, if you combine that with the inflation, which is bound to occur with these tariffs, then we could end up with the worst case scenario of stagflation, both rising prices, inflation, and falling production and employment. The last implication for the imposition of these tariffs relates to rent-seeking behaviour. And this is really about the interaction between business and government, import competing firms will have a profit incentive to lobby the Trump administration for higher specific tariffs, for greater protection for their particular sector. On the other hand, there'll also be the import reliant firms, those firms which use inputs that are imported. Those firms will have a profit incentive to lobby for specific exemptions from the tax. Lobbying here is simply a polite term for what amounts to what I would call corruption. That is, there's legalized corruption, which is making donations to political parties, but there's also obviously illegal corruption, that is bribery, and then there's just grovelling, as we've seen happen recently with the Trump administration and the major billionaires in the United States. This, unfortunately, only turbocharges the kind of crony capitalism that we tend to see in the United States, or what some people might call a kind of neo-feudalism.